Hello and welcome. Good evening. My name is Jason Linetsky, and as director of the Anderson Collection at Stanford University, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this very special and much anticipated program with noted Stanford art historian and author Alexander Nemerov. I'm thrilled to be here, grateful to our guest, and thankful to all of you for joining us here tonight. A quick note, captioning is available for this program. To use this feature, please click on the closed caption icon at the bottom of your window marked CC. First, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Stanford sits on the territory of Wechan, the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, who are the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. We recognize that every member of the community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native people. Today is a special day as it marks the first phase in reopening the Stanford Art Museums, the Anderson Collection at Stanford University, and the Cantor Art Center to the public. On behalf of both museums, I welcome you back and invite you to visit by reserving free time tickets on our websites. Staff at both museums have worked incredibly hard to provide our visitors with a safe and enjoyable experience, and we so look forward to seeing you again. The first floor of the Anderson Collection is open, and all but one gallery is open at the Cantor Art Center. Tonight, we're in for a real treat as Professor Alexander Nemerov takes us on a poetic journey back to the year 1956 and shares with us his compassionate observations and insights into the life of legendary abstract expressionist painter Helen Frankenthaler. Our program might be seen as a slice of the author's highly praised and most recent book, Fierce Poise, Helen Frankenthaler and 1950s New York, published last month by Penguin Press. The book has received rave reviews from Art in America, the Art Newspaper, Washington Post, Los Angeles Review of Books, the LA Times, Wall Street Journal, and Hyperallergic, to name just a few. In this biographical work, Professor Nemerov explores how Frankenthaler sought to become one of the 20th century's most respected painters during a time when male painters, such as Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning, were taking the art world by storm, and New York City was its cultural epicenter. Nemerov's book covers a decade in the artist's life, roughly 1950 to 1960, and focuses each chapter on a specific day or year that defined who Frankenthaler was as an artist. Deep research and reflection form the foundation of the stories Nemerov shares. We learn of the artist's upbringing, some remarkable relationships she had with critics, artists, and artworks, and of the impact of her first solo exhibition at the Jewish Museum in 1959. We read of great mid-century New York moments, and from a more autobiographical perspective, some of what drives the author to approach his subject with such exuberance, intimacy, and joy. Learning about Frankenthaler's life and process during the period covered in this book is especially illuminating as it leads up to the year and moment that Frankenthaler completed a painting in the Anderson Collection at Stanford University, Approach from 1962. And that work, as in many of those Professor Nemerov discusses, I'm inspired by the artist's passion for paint, for color, and for chance encounter, as much as I am by her dedication to originality, process, and intentional artistic practice. While I would love to invite you to see Approach in person at the museum this spring and summer, you will have that opportunity this coming fall when the museum is fully reopened and our permanent collection is again on display. As a final word of introduction, Alexander Nemerov is the chair of the Art and Art History Department at Stanford, the Carl and Marilyn Thoma Provostio Professor of the Arts and Humanities, and the author of the book about which he will speak tonight, Fierce Poise, Helen Frankenthaler and 1950s New York. He teaches many classes at Stanford, and as he has shared with me, loves teaching at the Anderson Collection and looks forward to doing so in person again soon. That time will certainly come this fall, but we're fortunate Professor Nemerov has joined us tonight and has generously agreed to take questions from the audience at the end of his presentation. I encourage you to submit your questions during the program using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will have a chance to address some of them at the end of our program tonight. And so, without further ado, I'm honored to welcome our guest, Alexander Nemerov.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you, Amy, for setting this all up. And also thank everybody for coming tonight. I just want to speak for a bit just about one chapter from my book. And as Jason says, then invite your questions. And the chapter in question really focuses on, like all the chapters in the book, one day in a year in Helen's life. And the painting in that chapter is this one called Eden from that year, 1956. And I want to say right away, as you look at this picture, which is quite large, and you see it in person, 9 by 10 feet, that there's a challenge for us. I think it's fair to say with Helen's work, I mean, how are we going to enter into this and regard it as more than, even in a praiseworthy sense, more than a kind of inspired improvisation that is pretty and sort of, vibrant and all these words? How are we going to make pretty be powerful? I think that's the whole gambit here for me tonight. So looking at this picture, which Helen made in a kind of, as it were, a perfect storm of art training and spontaneity. So craft and intuition, let's say. I realize that those terms are just placeholders now for what we really want to try to accomplish tonight, which is to enter into this picture. And let me say, first of all, that a little bit about who Helen was, for those of you who are not fully aware of her. She was born in New York in 1928, and she ended up, I'm sorry about this. I know it's important that people see me. So she was born in 1928 in New York. She went to Bennington College. This is a photograph of her senior year there at that Southern Vermont school. And, she's very, I think we could say, put together here. It's right outside the Commons building, elegant jacket, so on. But I think we have to understand a couple of things here that this photograph both indicates and also suppresses. One, suppresses Helen, was really, by her own statement, a mess as an adolescent. She was very close to her father, the New York State Supreme Court Justice Alfred Frankenthaler, who died after a relatively brief illness in 1940 when Helen was 11. And that sent Helen into a real tailspin where she developed a series of psychosomatic illnesses and became very neurotic and anxious, and emerged out of that only towards the latter part of high school, when she discovered painting seriously. And this is what she studied at Bennington, but she studied many other things. And she did so with joy. And this is a way that this photograph is such a nice indicator of her. The smile, accompanied, if we can imagine it, with the laugh, for which she was well known her whole life, the Helen laugh. One of Helen's very best friends at Bennington was Miriam Marx, the daughter of Groucho Marx, just to give you a sense of who she hung out with. Miriam was far crazier than Helen, and indeed got kicked out of school right before graduation. Another story. But another thing that this smile indicates for me, the kind of chutzpah of the smile, is between junior and senior year, Helen went down to New York with another classmate to interview Marlon Brando, who was then starring in A Streetcar Named Desire. And they did succeed in managing to get an interview where, for like a few minutes, while Brando, basically dressed as Stanley Kowalski and behaving no differently than Stanley Kowalski, wolfed down some food in a cafeteria down the street from the theater and gave them a few pointers, Helen especially, about what it took to succeed in art. And, he basically said, good luck. Helen, as I mentioned, came from New York, and she was the youngest. There she is, lower left, of three sisters. Marjorie on the right, the oldest, Gloria, the middle one. Marjorie, 6 years older than Helen, and Gloria, 5 years older than baby Helen. But here in this photograph taken not long after she returned to Manhattan after graduation, there's the sense, you don't know it from the photograph, but I can tell you that Gloria and Marjorie already are married and already have children. There's the sense that Helen, who emerges out of that artsy blackness, just like her sisters, will do the same. But, it's going to be different. Her dad, when Helen was just a tyke walking down the street in front of her mother and father in New York in the 1930s, he would turn to his wife and say, watch that girl, meaning Helen, she's going to be fantastic. And that was prophetic. So here is Helen, also in that year 1950, just after graduating. She's there at a costume ball dressed as a Picasso, with the displaced breasts represented by balloons, the shower curtain as the backdrop, a mop for the hair. Picasso's Girl with Mirror. She's there with her good pal Gabby Rogers, who went on to become a Hollywood actress. They're there at the largest ballroom in the United States. They're at the Hotel Astor. It's an artist's benefit ball. And this photograph appeared in Life magazine. Like, Helen's already, I think, interested in knowing how to press certain buttons to get ahead, to be noticed, even though she, in effect, is a 21-year-old nobody at this time. But she rates a color photograph in Life magazine. You can see it's the Picasso thing going on here. And in fact, that's what Helen's work was, very clearly derived from. That is Picasso's art at this time, a painting from 1950, one that Helen was very proud of, called Woman on a Horse, which, there in a room, you can see there's the corner of the room down in the lower right, just above her signature. There is, in this non sequitur way, this Picasso-like figure on a horse with a riding crop. This is the kind of work Helen was doing, and indeed it's very closely derived from pictures like the girl before a mirror that Helen was posing as at that ball that same year, a painting that is at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and which she knew well, right? So if we just stopped here, we'd say, well, this is, Helen is a very gifted, intense, intelligent imitator of Picasso. But this painting on the left is faithful in that regard, because Helen proudly displayed it. It was still smelling of varnish that night at an exhibition of Bennington alumni works, so works by recent Bennington grads. And Helen, drumming up publicity, invited this man, Clement Greenberg, to come to the show. And she was escorting Greenberg, 20 years her senior, around the show. And he came, more or less, one imagines, with the very look on his face, discerning, arrogant, confident, very smart, that we see in the photograph on the right. He came to this picture not knowing who painted it. And he said, oh, I don't like that one. And Helen laughed, and they were getting along great. And long story short, Greenberg, they started dating, and Greenberg really took her into a world she might not have known. And specifically, the world was that of Jackson Pollock, the painter that Greenberg really had, I think, discovered or first championed, been the first to champion back in 1942, 43. And in particular, Helen went into this very space on East 57th Street, Betty Parsons Gallery, to see maybe one of the most famous art exhibitions of the 20th century, though she couldn't have known it was that at the time. But there's an elevator we can't see in this picture, but it goes up to the second floor. She and Greenberg rode up there. Greenberg just didn't push her out of the elevator, but said, "You go on, you take a look, you're on your own." And this was probably the most formative experience for Helen in her aesthetic life, because she couldn't believe the freedom here. This is not like Picasso, not imitating anything. The painting Autumn Rhythm is directly in front of us, 8 by 17 feet, like the one on the left. She was just drawn into this. She described it as going to Portugal and not speaking Portuguese, but wanting so much to live there. You know, she didn't know how to do what was being done, but she felt liberated by this. And it wasn't just an artistic thing, but it was also a social thing. So there's Helen with Greenberg, and they ultimately had a 5-year relationship there with Pollock on the right and Lee Krasner, Pollock's wife, also a painter, on the left. And Helen is just being drawn into this world, right? Krasner was born in 1908, Greenberg in 1909, Pollock in 1912, and Helen in 1928. So it's a kind of fast track into this world, but it's to do above all, I feel, with art. And Pollock's example set Helen away from, started to move her away from the picture that I showed you, woman on a horse. This is Helen with her first one-person show the next year, November of 51, at the upstart Tibor Denage Gallery on East 53rd Street, with the gallery's owner, John Myers, there on the right. There's Helen gesturing where she wants paintings hung. Greenberg's right there. The ever thin former circus acrobat Alfred Leslie, also an artist, also a Tibor Denage artist, is on the left. Alfred is actually one of the people who, he's now in his 90s, that I was able to interview, one of only 2 people who were contemporaries of Helen's that I interviewed for the book, and fabulous guy. In any case, the painting behind Helen there is called Sightseers. And I think we could just put our art history caps on and say, hey, I get it. I get that from 1950 to 1951, there's something totally different happening with Helen's work. And, you know, this isn't Pollock, and it's crayon and paint and so on. It's still an easel painting. It's not a drip painting, but something has changed here. And in fact, the next year, 1952, is when Helen started really making paintings as Pollock did, which is to say, by placing the canvas on the ground, not on a vertical, and also not priming the canvas, and simply going at it in a kind of spontaneous but fluidly controlled and judged way. This is the painting called Mountains and Sea from 1952, which she painted all in one afternoon. There's a signature, or the date at the bottom right, October 26, 1952. And, you know, this painting is one that one would never in a million years mistake for a Pollock. And yet the method, as I said, is completely Pollock's, and there's no question of derivation or stealing. It's to do with a common, it's about a kind of freedom, artistic freedom. And any artist knows that they've encountered one artist or another who has shown them the way to what is already within them, to a kind of creativity that required to be let loose by means of the example of another. And the comparison on the screen is illustrating exactly that point. Now, looking at this, though, it does bring us to the following fact as we return to our main painting. So you see the date there, 1956. Pollock was dead. Pollock died in a more or less self-inflicted drunk driving accident on August 11th, 1956. Eden was painted in late October 1956. One thing we have to understand about this painting then right away is that it's a painting made by someone who knows Jackson Pollock. Her inspiration is dead. Are you wrong in thinking of it as a joyous painting? Jason mentioned that word joy in the intro. No, I don't think you are. So that's interesting right there. And I do think there's something when Pollock died, as much as there was genuine mourning, I think there was also a sense of freedom and possibility opened up for younger artists. But what I want to underscore here as we look into the particular kind of joy here, which is ultimately a very complex joy, is Helen's own take on this. And what I want you to notice about this is this line here, and then maybe this line here. If we go back to, or if we look at this slide here of Helen in her studio, she made Eden in her studio in her apartment on West End Avenue, the Upper West Side. You can see that this slide, this photograph on the left, and the image I showed you before of her painting show you the contours of a room. And I think that's what we're seeing here. And what's the significance of that? Well, critics, I think, rightly talked about the cosmic feeling of Pollock's abstractions. They were beyond like ordinary space and time, like those 8x17 sheets of drips like Autumn Rhythm were meant to take you into, in mid-20th century terms, like galaxies, cosmos, interstellar spaces, etc. Helen's abstraction, by contrast, is intimate. It's physical. It's grounded in specific places, and as a correlate to that, it's really connected to her body in very powerful ways. And although it's not wrong to think of Pollock's abstraction as syncopatingly related to his own brando and kind of muscularity and kind of performative machismo, I mean, that's not wrong. I think his body is also not as present in his work as Helen's is in hers. And it's just like, there's just a feeling of her, as in the photograph on the left, of her kind of hovering over, moving over, and partly through the actual embodied forms like the red hand, incarnating herself, almost imprinting herself in the pictures she made. You might be thinking, well, how does the title Eden factor into all this? I think it's important to remember that Helen, as she also very much stressed, she titled her paintings after they were made, not before. So in other words, she titled, and she was very good at titles, she titled them to sort of as a response to what she had more or less improvisationally, intuitively made, albeit intuitively in the sense of working in a structured, within a sort of structured set of attitudes and long learned approaches about how to apply paint and things like this. But the point being that Eden, which might suggest a million things, might refer to the pendulous fruit on which those paired 100s appear, for example, is just, an impressionistic title at the end, not a tell-all to indicate something like that is discernible, factual, truthful in the work, right? But Eden does suggest to me sensuousness, a kind of freedom that is related to her body and related to the intimate spaces in which that body could find a kind of flowering and expression. Now, Helen's work as the work of an artist who was a woman though not a woman artist, because Helen really hated that term. And it's one of the richnesses of her work, kind of irony of it even, that she really became super recognized only in the era of feminism, starting in the late 60s and early 70s, even though all the way until she died in 2011, she insisted that she was not a feminist in any way. So she was an artist who was a woman. She's aware of bringing a woman's experience into her work, of course, but she resisted this notion of being a woman artist. In any case, here she is paired with the two most sort of equally rising, equally notable painters who are women than Joan Mitchell on the left, Grace Hartigan on the right, which raises some questions about how the three of them are, responding to the notion of showing, I don't know, a kind of sensuous abstract world at this time. And Mitchell on the left, she's close enough to Helen in the photograph, but only physically close. She really detested Helen and referred to her contemptuously as that Kotex painter, meaning to disparage Helen's staining technique. The woman on the right, however, Grace Hartigan, was more or less a friend of Helen's. She did criticize Helen privately, one time saying, in a way that really hurt Helen, actually, that Helen's paintings seemed like they were made between cocktails and dinner, which was also a slight on Helen's affluent background. Grace's background was not affluent. In any case, they were friends, but what I think is interesting is they both became recognized and both became featured, along with Mitchell, in some beautiful color photographs taken by Gordon Parks for Life magazine in 1957 for an article called Women Artists in Ascendance, as they both negotiated how to be, and how to, if you like, present their own innermost sense of themselves and what art might express, which in Helen's case, as you've heard me say, had to do with a kind of very intimate, I'll throw another word in, vulnerable account of her impressions, her sense of being alive. They handled it differently. And what I mean by that is, if you come back to Eden and look then on the right to a painting by Hartigan, which is now at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, called Billboard, another very large abstraction, you'll see that it's not really correct to say that Hartigan's painting is an abstraction. It's sort of moving into what Helen, who could dish too, privately disparaged as subject matter abstract expressionism, which, that was horrible for her. And so you can see the title being an indicator for Hartigan, that the title Billboard, that her abstraction is more or less incorporating the glossy, happy, smiley faces of American advertising in billboards, magazines, etc., and presenting them as a kind of, synonymous with the vibrancy, the excitement of advanced abstract painting. It is, to me at least, the painting on the right, and I do like Grace Hartigan's art, nonetheless, a kind of accommodation with commercial accessibility, let's say. Whereas Helen's picture, I guess you could think of the 100s as having something to do with money, and it's true, the market for abstract expressionism, and indeed the so-called New York art world that we take for granted now, was kind of coming into being in the late 50s, whereas it was pretty non-existent in the early 50s when Helen started. You could think of those hundreds as somehow referring to, I don't know, monetary numbers, etc. I don't know if that's true, but I think the main thing is Helen's fantasy, this is my take, Helen's fantasy is just stranger, more lyrically odd, more vulnerable, more to do with the space, the intimate space of the studio, rather than the externalized space of the billboard and the outreach and the public, right? And Helen did say later in life, but I know it must relate to her whole way of being back in the 50s, that as soon as the artist starts to think of an audience, they're ruined. And I subscribe to that myself. It has to come from within. So there are these different patterns of joy, which are related to American commerce, related to, I don't know, to some extent, femininity as well then. But something else, because one of the fascinating things about Helen's painting Eden is that it was painted late October 1956, when two very cataclysmic, very threatening political events were unfolding. One was the Hungarian Revolution, and Helen was talking about this in her letters, so she's aware of it. And yet I want you to notice that Eden, you would never know in a million years that it has anything to do with, in fact, it doesn't have anything to do with events like the photograph on the right shows. So, there's a willful seeking after a private joy in a politically tumultuous time. Very interesting. And the other event is the Suez Canal crisis, with the Egyptians scuttling ships in the middle of the canal, preventing all commercial traffic, as a dispute over rights to the canal unfolded. Noticing that as well, the Soviets becoming involved there too, like possibly nuclear catastrophes unfolding, but Helen is painting Eden. And I just want to, as we say, give her a shout out for that, to pursue the sort of private joy, which in my take is not a commodified joy, like joy for sale, though the painting, of course, was for sale. It was unsold, but it was for sale. It's avowing the private, the world of ephemeral sensations and feelings, the tears of a day, the pleasures of a day, the sense of a room, the sense of one's own body as righteous phenomena that require no apologizing for, that can be expressed, fearlessly. And in that sense, I think Helen's the person she really connects to in this regard is the poet Frank O'Hara, who is so photogenic, so handsome, and shown in this photograph from just a little later, 1959, whose working method was like Helen's, very improvisational. I mean, he could write a great poem in 4 minutes of furious typing at his typewriter, with the radio on and so on, and his roommates having drinks in the next room, etc. But who most immediately, just in the same days that Helen is painting Eden, so late October 1956, wrote a poem called A Raspberry Sweater, which you might think, well, what's it going to have to do with this painting? Well, nothing in terms of raspberry sweaters, but everything in terms of saying Hungarian Revolution, Suez crisis, world events. After all, there's a presidential election coming right up at that time too. I don't care. And it's not that I am unmindful, but I don't understand art in those terms. And A Raspberry Sweater, which was dedicated to his friend, photographer George Montgomery, goes like this. A raspberry sweater, it is next to my flesh, that's why. Meaning, I always mean that to take that to mean, if you want a justification, like because it's next to my flesh. I do what I want, yes. And in the pale New Hampshire twilight, he's up there in New Hampshire visiting Montgomery, a black bug sits in the blue, strumming its legs together. That's a poet. Black bug sits in the blue, strumming its legs together. Mournful glass and daisies closing, so kind of elegiac there. It's getting dark. Hay swells in the nostrils, sensuous. We shall go to the motorcycle races in Laconia, like we'll go have fun and come back all calm and warm. That's it. That's the poem. There's a feeling of like personal hedonistic pleasure that unites O'Hara, who was gay, and Helen, who was not, and unites their enterprise in one way, but in another way, their methodologically, their enterprises are connected in the sense of their, just the way they put words on the page or put paint on the canvas. And O'Hara is famously described as the poet of, poems that are basically, they're called first I did one thing, first I did this, then I did that poems. And one of the first of those poems that he wrote was in August of 56. O'Hara worked at the Museum of Modern Art at the information booth at first, then as a curator, and he'd go out on his lunch break and just kind of look around and take in the sights, and often he would write a poem. One's called A Step Away from Them, which is one of these lunchtime, did this, did that poems. An excerpt, neon in daylight is a great pleasure, as Edwin Denby would write, as are light bulbs in daylight. I stopped for a cheeseburger at Juliet's Corner. Giulietta Massina, wife of Federico Fellini, El Bellettrice, and chocolate malted. A lady in foxes on such a day puts her poodle in a cab. He's just seeing things. There's something kindredly improvisational to the painting we see on the left, made in the same city in the same year. But notice how it takes a dark turn, a step away from them. Who is the them? There are several Puerto Ricans on the avenue today, which makes it beautiful and warm. Then without transition. First, Bunny died. That was a poet, playwright, Violet Lang, who was a good friend of O'Hara's from Cambridge, Mass. Then John Latouche, lyricist. Then Jackson Pollock. But is the earth as full as life was full of them? And this step away from them, which factors, which informs, shapes the pleasure, shapes the sort of lyrical observations of a day on earth, I think infuses Helen's painting too. I said it was a complex joy that it shows. And, I want to call your attention to, again, that hand, the upper right, and, that stop sign, in other words. And in the book, like, I could never really figure out how intensively to deal with this hand. So I just kind of suggested a couple of things about it. But to me, I feel that hand is connected very powerfully to two deaths. One is that of Helen's mother, who is shown here in a photograph from 8 years before, when Helen was between her junior and senior years at Bennington and was going on a cruise, or not a cruise, a transatlantic voyage with Gabby Rogers to Europe. And, that cake says Bon Voyage, Helen. Martha Frankenthaler, as you might be able to tell by her whole aspect, her whole aura here, with the hat, the beauty, the eyebrows, was quite a beautiful woman, about 6 feet tall, said Helen, very earthy, very demanding woman. And, the somewhat claustrophobic feel of this photograph in the little cabin on the transatlantic cruise liner suggests that it was a complicated relation for Helen, all the more so when 2 years after this photograph was taken, Martha, the mother, began to feel not so good. No one knew what it was. It turned out it was Parkinson's. And in 1954, Martha Frankenthaler jumped to her death from her 14th floor balcony in the Upper East Side. stop. A second death that I think informs Eden happened the very month that Helen painted this picture, or very early that month. So about 3 or 4 weeks before the painting was made, a friend of Helen's named Dottie Kahn, Kahn, also jumped to her death. And Dottie was the wife of the freshman year roommate of Marjorie Frankenthaler, so Helen's older sister's husband, if that makes sense. And Helen had met Dottie, thought she was great, really smart. Dottie was really stultified in her marriage. She may have had an abortion earlier in 1956. She was clinically depressed. She was institutionalized. She left the institution. She jumped off a bridge. She left a 2-year-old daughter, who Helen recalled fondly seeing at the time of the daughter, whose name is Jenny, daughter's birth. And I just want to emphasize 2 things for you here, just in closing, before I take a few questions. One is, the joy here is so wrapped up with the fragility of life. Helen felt better than any artist I've ever studied what it was like to be alive and to give artistic form to the impressions, the sensations of existence, and to understand how precious because fugitive the sun is, the light, like the rays at the upper left are. It's not a quote unquote message or anything like that. It's a feeling that's wrapped up in making and in contemplating the picture. That radiance is nothing without the sense of its fugitive and fragile nature. The second thing is, I don't know, I think one of the most moving things for me about this book is, I'm right here in my study now, and down below me is the patio of our house. And a few years ago, Helen's niece came over to our house, and who looks exactly like Helen, as she acknowledges, which is itself mysterious. But anyway, I was just saying to Helen's niece, wow, wouldn't it be great if I'm just so interested in that 2-year-old, that Dottie Kahn left. Like, I really would love, it's probably not possible, but I just wish like I could talk to her. And Helen's niece says, oh, I know who that is. That's Jenny Kaufman. And, within a few days, I'm talking to Jenny Kaufman on the phone. We met in New York. We become friends, is what I can say. I mean, Jenny is a psychotherapist who specializes in suicide and the effects of it on families, on children. She's incredibly smart. Writing the book, instead of just being like a kind of reportage, and ends up like creating friendships. It also ends up drawing people back into the past, and the past up into our moment now, in ways that are beautiful, actually, in which bygone figures, tragic figures, kind of come alive somehow. And they do so through the power of art. Helen's pictures live on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was wonderful. Incredibly illuminating, and very exciting to be able to hear from you, your reflections, and to see the relationship of the works and other artists to Helen's career, And I appreciate you sharing as openly and fluidly as you did. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I want to just remind everybody that Alex is excited to answer questions from the audience. And so we have a few, but if there are others that you would like to share, please post those through the Q&A button on your screen. Maybe just to start, there's sort of a very broad question, but I think that maybe it's an interesting just point to begin at least. And there's a question really that just simply says, why Helen Frankenthaler? Why now?
I think I wrote about Helen because I like her paintings, and I like the ones from the 50s the best. And I like them because she was in her 20s when she painted them. And, Jason, I didn't talk about Approach today, the painting at the Anderson collection, but that's from a little later, 1962. And I think it's a beautiful painting. It's a more achieved painting. It's a more resolved painting than, for example, Eden. And, when I think about my own 20s and how unresolved and inchoate a lot of my own feelings about the world and myself were, I think that's what drew me to Helen. And, I think the way I put it is, Helen was able to portray the sensation of being so vibrantly alive as one is in one's 20s, so responded to the world in real time. Like, she's like the Shakespeare of being in your 20s in the 1950s, as far as I can tell. Whereas I, at age 57 now, only am just kind of slowpoke like coming to an awareness of how incredible that time was, and looking to Helen for some, not guidance, but perspective on my own feelings from that time. And why now? I think that's why, it's a personal thing. And I agree with Helen that one does it for oneself, and that in addressing a personal concern, an urgent personal concern, one hopefully writes something or paints something that is accessible to others.
Mm-hmm. There's another question that just came in that's maybe a bit related to your answer, at least, which is, can you tell us about any lingering questions about Helen's life that you wish you could answer, or perhaps you could ask her yourself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a great question. I'm sure there are. I almost feel, though, that it's a curious feeling, but I feel like Helen is independent from me, from me having written the book, that we kind of came together in this intense dialogue beyond the grave, because I never met her. She died in 2011. I wouldn't have had the guts, frankly, to meet her. I wasn't ready to meet her. It was only in the last few years that I felt, okay, I'm ready. I feel like I can have a conversation with Helen now. But now that the book is written, I feel like she's has an independent reality away from me, apart from me.
Okay, no, thank you. There are a number of questions about maybe about Helen's technique and her paint colors. If you can talk a little bit about those paint colors. Also, maybe specifically about Eden. You talk about the red hand as a stop sign relating to death. And you mentioned the possibility that the hundreds might refer to $100 bills. Are there other reads of these hundreds that you might share or that you've thought about?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I really, perhaps because I can feel Helen looking over my shoulder, and she was so stern about, like, there's no reading of her paintings, there's no, I mean, there are things in them, but they're the very point of them is that they're ambiguous. You know, she has a painting from 1957, which is a great painting called Seven Types of Ambiguity, named after a William Empson text of literary criticism. And so, although I appreciate the question, you know, I feel like perhaps a more useful way to think about the hundreds might be in terms of, let's say, symmetry. You know, there's something about the pairing of the two that seems important, the sort of mirror image of the two. And that to me connects to, you know, bodily orientation and like left hand, right hand, and judging one's relation to the picture as it's on the ground, but also judging how someone might respond to it once it's raised onto a wall. I know those are kind of frightfully art historical examples, but or ideas, but I think that's, you know, that's my feeling there.
And
Yeah.
did Helen, you know, ever speak of her work as an abstraction of anything in particular, a place or a thing or a specific experience? And you mentioned a lot of things that were happening, you know, concurrent to the painting of her,
Yeah.
to her paintings, but
Yeah.
was she
Thank you for
specific about
that.
any of those?
Yeah, I don't think so, because she felt she cited the fiction of Mary McCarthy, a writer from that time, as being very gimmicky. And what she meant by that is the fiction is so autobiographical, had so many, you know, indicators of actual experience that you couldn't help but speculate on, like, is this Mary McCarthy? To whom this horrible thing happened? Is it a friend? And Helen was very adamant about, here's the key, using her feelings, her experiences as a medium, but not as the message. You know, feeling is a kind of raw material, a sensation. I come to the studio sad, I come to the studio happy, or more likely some strange, indescribable mixture of the two. And I ride that out, and maybe in the choice of colors, choice of design, but the work does not end up being about that. And I'll give you a very specific example. I mentioned Alfred Leslie, you know, who's in his 90s now, as one of the two people I talked to from the 50s who were Helen's contemporaries who were still alive. The other is actually Helen's man friend from late 1956, when she was when she was painting Eden, a guy named Herb Gold, a novelist, friend of Saul Bellow, living in San Francisco right now. Herb Gold. Fascinating to talk to Herb Gold. And I could say, you know, Helen was a lot more into Herb than Herb was into Helen. And if I wanted to, I don't know, say more about it, I'd say Eden is a picture that speaks of her joy in meeting this really handsome, smart guy. And, you know, Helen's relationships are a thing unto themselves. This painting was made after her breakup with Greenberg and before she met Robert Motherwell, who was really the love of her life and to whom she would get married in 1958. But, you know, the painting is not about being in love with Herb Gold, not in a million years. You know, that feeling, if it's there at all in this picture, biographically, autobiographically, is there as a kind of, again, like a raw medium, not as a message.
Okay. Yeah. No. That makes a lot of sense. Let's see. There are a couple of questions about Helen's time at Bennington. One, sort of how traditional or conventional or formal was Frankenthaler's art education at Bennington? Did she excel? Did she rebel? And the second question was asking about, were there specific professors that influenced her in specific ways?
Yeah, really good questions. I think they finally boil down to one question, because her professor really did influence her a great deal. Her art professor, whose name was Paul Feely, Feeley, who was actually from Menlo Park. And he was born in 1910, so he's 18 years older than her. And he taught her that Picasso mode. And more than that, he taught her the high seriousness of being an artist. Not that she didn't already have a sense of that when she arrived, but, you know, at Bennington, no one was painting as an adornment to life. Like, it was serious. Writing poetry, studying poetry was serious. And, you know, just last to rhyme this question with, I think, the first question about why Helen, something I say in the introduction is that my father was a professor at Bennington, English professor, and his first year as a professor was Helen's senior year. She took a class with him. Sometime later, I was born in Bennington, and there's just kind of a connection, though, again, I never knew her, but I first thought of writing a book on Helen, Jason, in the 1990s.
Wow, right.
Yeah. It was just an idea at that time, but it was not wrong. I guess you could just say it had a long foreground. It was coming from a very personal place.
Yeah.
And my dad was actually best friends with Paul Feely. So there's just a connection. Yeah.
Well, in this case, good things definitely come to those who wait. So well done on that. And
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing the book at the time that you have. Yeah.
Yes, you're welcome.
Yeah. Well, Alex, you've been very generous with sharing with us today and with your time. The audience has asked some wonderful questions, and we appreciate that all very much. I'm delighted that this was a conversation, and we encourage everybody here to find, you know, some joy, hopefully untroubled joy, but joy in your days. And we welcome everybody back to the Anderson and to the Cantor as things have gotten to a place where it is again safe to do so. And Alex, I just want to extend a final thanks to you for your time here, for your dedication to teaching and to engaging as broadly as you do with the Stanford community and the public, and to your connections to the museums and to the Anderson collection. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you. All right, everybody. Stay well. Good night.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.